Chapter 4. The Civilization of the Greeks. Chapter Outline and Focus Questions. Early Greece. How did the geography of Greece affect Greek history in terms of politics, military developments, and the economy? Who was Homer, and why was his work used as the basis for Greek education? The Greek city-states, c. 750 to c. 500 BCE. What were the chief features of the polis, or city-state? And how did the city-states of Athens and Sparta differ? The high point of Greek civilization, classical Greece. What did the Greeks mean by democracy, and in what ways was the Athenian political system a democracy? What effect did the two great conflicts of the 5th century, the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War, have on Greek civilization? The rise of Macedonia and the conquests of Alexander. How was Alexander the Great able to amass his empire, and what was his legacy? The world of the Hellenistic kingdoms. How did the political, economic, and social institutions of the Hellenistic world differ from those of classical Greece? Critical thinking. In what ways did the culture of the Hellenistic period differ from that of the classical period, and what do those differences suggest about society in the two periods? Connections to today. What are the similarities and differences between ancient Athenian democracy and modern democracy in the United States? During the era of civil war in China, known as the period of the Warring States, a civil war also erupted on the northern shores of the Mediterranean Sea. In 431 BCE, two dramatically different Greek city-states, Athens and Sparta, fought for domination of the Greek world. The people of Athens felt secure behind their walls and, in the first winter of the war, held a public funeral to honor those who had died in battle. On the day of the ceremony, the citizens of Athens joined in a procession, with the relatives of the dead wailing for their loved ones. As was the custom in Athens, one leading citizen was asked to address the crowd, and on this day it was Pericles who spoke to the people. He talked about the greatness of Athens and reminded the Athenians of the strength of their political system. Our constitution, he said, is called a democracy because power is in the hands not of a minority but of the whole people. When it is a question of settling private disputes, everyone is equal before the law. Just as our political life is free and open, so is our day-to-day life in our relations with each other. Here each individual is interested not only in his own affairs but in the affairs of the state as well. In this famous funeral oration, Pericles gave voice to the ideals of democracy and the importance of the individual, ideals that were quite different from those of some other ancient societies, in which the individual was subordinated to a larger order based on obedience to an exalted emperor. The Greeks asked some basic questions about human life. What is the nature of the universe? What is the purpose of human existence? What is our relationship to divine forces? What constitutes a community? What constitutes a state? What is true education? What are the true sources of law? What is truth itself, and how do we realize it? Not only did the Greeks provide answers to these questions, but they also created a system of logical, analytical thought to examine them. Their answers and their system of rational thought laid the intellectual foundation for Western civilization's understanding of the human condition. The remarkable story of ancient Greek civilization begins with the arrival of the Greeks around 1900 BCE. By the 8th century BCE, the characteristic institution of ancient Greek life, the polis, or city-state, had emerged. Greek civilization flourished and reached its height in the classical era of the 5th century BCE, but the inability of the Greek city-states to end their fratricidal warfare eventually left them vulnerable to the Macedonian king Philip II and helped bring an end to the era of independent Greek city-states. Although the city-states were never the same after their defeat by the Macedonian monarch, this defeat did not end the influence of the Greeks. Philip's son Alexander led the Macedonians and Greeks on a spectacular conquest of the Persian Empire and opened the door to the spread of Greek culture throughout the Middle East. Early Greece. Focus questions. How did the geography of Greece affect Greek history in terms of politics, military developments, and the economy? Who was Homer, and why was his work used as the basis for Greek education? Geography played an important role in Greek history. Compared to Mesopotamia and Egypt, Greece occupied a small area, a mountainous peninsula that encompassed only 45,000 square miles of territory, about the size of the state of Louisiana. The mountains and the sea were especially significant. Much of Greece consists of small plains and river valleys surrounded by mountain ranges 8,000 to 10,000 feet high. The mountains isolated Greeks from one another, causing Greek communities to follow their own separate paths and develop their own ways of life. Over a period of time, these communities became so fiercely attached to their independence that they were willing to fight one another to gain advantage. No doubt the small size of these independent Greek communities fostered participation in political affairs and unique cultural expressions, but the rivalry among them also led to the bitter warfare that ultimately devastated Greek society. The sea also influenced Greek society. Greece had a long seacoast, dotted by bays and inlets that provided numerous harbors. The Greeks also inhabited a number of islands to the west, south, and east of the Greek mainland. It is no accident that the Greeks became seafarers who sailed out into the Aegean and Mediterranean seas to make contact with the outside world and later to establish colonies that would spread Greek civilization throughout the Mediterranean region. Topography helped determine the major territories into which Greece was ultimately divided. South of the Gulf of Corinth was the Peloponnesus, virtually an island attached by a tiny isthmus to the mainland. Consisting mostly of hills, mountains, and small valleys, the Peloponnesus was the location of Sparta, as well as the site of Olympia, where athletic games were held. Northeast of the Peloponnesus was the Attic Peninsula, or Attica, the home of Athens, hemmed in by mountains to the north and west and surrounded by the sea to the south and east. Northwest of Attica was Boeotia in central Greece, with its chief city of Thebes. To the north of Boeotia was Thessaly, which contained the largest plains and became a great producer of grain and horses. To the north of Thessaly lay Macedonia, which was not of much importance in Greek history until 338 BCE, when a Macedonian king Philip II conquered the Greeks. Minoan and Crete. The earliest civilization in the Aegean region emerged on the large island of Crete, southeast of the Greek mainland. A Bronze Age civilization that used metals, especially bronze, in making weapons had been established there by 2800 BCE. This civilization was discovered at the turn of the 20th century by the English archaeologist Arthur Evans, who named it Minoan after Minos, a legendary king of Crete. In language and religion, the Minoans were not Greek, although they did have some influence on the peoples of the Greek mainland. Evans's excavations on Crete unearthed an enormous palace complex at Knossos, near modern Heraklion, that was most likely the center of a far-ranging sea empire, probably largely commercial. We know from the archaeological remains that the people of Minoan and Crete were accustomed to sea travel and had made contact with the more advanced civilization of Egypt. Egyptian products have been found in Crete and Cretan products in Egypt. Minoan Cretans also had contacts with and exerted influence on the Greek-speaking inhabitants of the Greek mainland. The Minoan civilization reached its height between 2000 and 1450 BCE. The palace at Knossos, the royal seat of the kings, was an elaborate structure that included numerous private living rooms for the royal family and workshops for making decorated vases, ivory figurines, and jewelry. Even bathrooms with elaborate drains, like those found at Mohenjo-daro in India, were part of the complex. The rooms were decorated with brightly colored frescoes showing sporting events and nature scenes. Storerooms in the palace held enormous jars of oil, wine, and grain, paid as taxes in kind to the king. The centers of Minoan civilization on Crete eventually suffered a collapse. Many historians believe that a tsunami triggered by a powerful volcanic eruption on the island of Thera was responsible for destroying towns and ships on the north coast of Crete, while volcanic ash devastated the land. Although people began to rebuild, there is evidence that mainland Greeks, known as the Mycenaeans, invaded and pillaged many centers, including Knossos, which was destroyed around 1450 BCE. The first Greek state, Mycenae. The term Mycenaean is derived from Mycenae, Mycenae, a remarkable fortified site excavated by the amateur German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann starting in 1870. Mycenae was one center in a Mycenaean Greek civilization that flourished between 1600 and 1100 BCE. The Mycenaean Greeks were part of the Indo-European family of peoples who spread from their original location into southern and western Europe, India, and Persia. One group entered the territory of Greece from the north around 1900 BCE and eventually managed to gain control of the Greek mainland and develop a civilization. Mycenaean civilization, which reached its high point between 1400 and 1200 BCE, consisted of a number of powerful monarchies centered in fortified palace complexes. Like Mycenae itself, the palaces were built on hills and surrounded by gigantic stone walls. These various centers of power probably formed a loose confederacy of independent states, with Mycenae the strongest. The Mycenaeans were above all a warrior people who prided themselves on their heroic deeds in battle. Archaeological evidence indicates that the Mycenaean monarchies also developed an extensive commercial network. Mycenaean pottery has been found throughout the Mediterranean basin, in Syria and Egypt to the east and Sicily and southern Italy to the west. But some scholars also believe that the Mycenaeans, led by Mycenae itself, spread outward militarily, conquering Crete and making it part of the Mycenaean world. The most famous of all their supposed military adventures has come down to us in the epic poetry of Homer. Did the Mycenaean Greeks, led by Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, sack the city of Troy on the northwestern coast of Asia Minor around 1250 BCE? Scholars have debated this question ever since Schliemann began his excavations in 1870. Some believe that Homer's account does have a basis in fact, although there is little archaeological evidence to support it. By the late 13th century, Mycenaean Greece was showing signs of serious trouble. Mycenae itself was burned around 1190 BCE, and other Mycenaean centers show a similar pattern of destruction as new waves of Greek-speaking invaders moved into Greece from the north. By 1100 BCE, the Mycenaean culture was coming to an end, and the Greek world was entering a new period of considerable insecurity. The Greeks in a Dark Age, c. 1100 to c. 750 BCE. After the collapse of Mycenaean civilization, Greece entered a difficult era of declining population and falling food production. Because of the difficult conditions and our lack of knowledge about the period, historians refer to it as the Dark Age. Not until 850 BCE did farming and Greece itself revive. During the Dark Age, large numbers of Greeks left the mainland and migrated across the Aegean Sea to various islands and especially to the southwestern shore of Asia Minor, a strip of territory that came to be called Ionia. Two other major groups of Greeks settled in established parts of Greece. The Aeolian Greeks of northern and central Greece colonized the large island of Lesbos and the adjacent territory of the mainland. The Dorians established themselves in southwestern Greece, especially in the Peloponnesus, as well as on some of the South Aegean islands, including Crete. As trade and economic activity began to recover, iron replaced bronze in the construction of weapons, making them affordable for more people. At some point in the 8th century BCE, the Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet to give themselves a new system of writing. And near the very end of the Dark Age appeared the work of Homer, who has come to be viewed as one of the greatest poets of all time. Homer and Homeric Greece. The Iliad and the Odyssey, The first great epic poems of early Greece were based on stories that had been passed down from generation to generation. It is generally assumed that Homer made use of these oral traditions to compose the Iliad, his epic poem of the Trojan War. The war was sparked by Paris, a prince of Troy, who kidnapped Helen, wife of the king of the Greek state of Sparta, outraging all the Greeks. Under the leadership of the Spartan king's brother, Agamemnon of Mycenae, the Greeks attacked Troy. After 10 years of combat, the Greeks finally sacked the city. The Iliad is not so much the story of the war itself, however, as it is the tale of the Greek hero Achilles and how the wrath of Achilles led to disaster. The Odyssey, Homer's other masterpiece, is an epic romance that recounts the journeys of one of the Greek heroes, Odysseus, from the fall of Troy until his eventual return to his wife, Penelope, 20 years later. Although the Iliad and the Odyssey supposedly deal with the heroes of the Mycenaean age of the 13th century BCE, many scholars believe that they really describe the social conditions of the Dark Age. According to the Homeric view, Greece was a society based on agriculture in which a landed warrior aristocracy controlled much wealth and exercised considerable power. Homer's world reflects the values of aristocratic heroes. Homer's enduring importance. This, of course, explains the importance of Homer to later generations of Greeks. Homer did not so much record history as make it. The Greeks regarded the Iliad and the Odyssey as authentic history. They gave the Greeks an idealized past, somewhat like the concept of the Golden Age in ancient China, with a legendary age of heroes, and the poems came to be used as standard texts for the education of generations of Greek males. As one Athenian stated, "My father was anxious to see me develop into a good man. And as a means to this end he compelled me to memorize all of Homer." The values Homer inculcated were essentially the aristocratic values of courage and honor. See the box Homer's ideal of excellence above. It was important to strive for the excellence befitting a hero, which the Greeks called erete. In the warrior aristocratic world of Homer, erete is won in a struggle or contest. Through his willingness to fight, the hero protects his family and friends, preserves his own honor and his family's, and earns his reputation. In the Homeric world, aristocratic women, too, were expected to pursue excellence. Penelope, for example, the wife of Odysseus, the hero of the Odyssey, remains faithful to her husband and displays great courage and intelligence in preserving their household during her husband's long absence. Upon his return, Odysseus praises her for her excellence. "Madam, there is not a man in the wide world who could find fault with you. For your fame has reached heaven itself, like that of some perfect king, ruling a populous and mighty state with the fear of God in his heart, and upholding the right." To later generations of Greeks, these heroic values formed the core of aristocratic virtue, a fact that explains the tremendous popularity of Homer as an educational tool. Homer gave to the Greeks a single universally accepted model of heroism, honor, and nobility. But in time, as a new world of city-states emerged in Greece, new values of cooperation and community also transformed what the Greeks learned from Homer. The Greek city-states, c. 750 to c. 500 BCE. Focus question: what were the chief features of the polis, or city-state, and how did the city-states of Athens and Sparta differ? During the Dark Age, Greek villages gradually expanded and evolved into independent city-states. In the 8th century BCE, Greek civilization burst forth with new energies, beginning the period that historians have called the Archaic Age of Greece. Two major developments stand out in this era: the evolution of the city-state, or what the Greeks called a polis, plural, polis, as the central institution in Greek life, and the Greeks' colonization of the Mediterranean and Black Seas. The polis. In the most basic sense, a polis could be defined as a small but autonomous political unit in which all major political, social, and religious activities were carried out at one central location. The polis encompassed a town or city or even village and its surrounding countryside. But each had a central place where the citizens of the polis could assemble for political, social, and religious activities. In some polis, this central meeting point was a hill, like the Acropolis in Athens, which could serve as a place of refuge during an attack, and later at some sites came to be the religious center on which temples and public monuments were erected. Below the Acropolis would be an agora, an open space that served both as a market and as a place where citizens could assemble. Polis varied greatly in size, from a few square miles to a few hundred square miles. They also varied in population. Athens had a population of about 250,000 by the 5th century BCE, but most polis were much smaller, consisting of only a few hundred to several thousand people. Although our word politics is derived from the Greek term polis, the polis itself was much more than a political institution. It was a community of citizens in which all political, economic, social, cultural, and religious activities were focused. As a community, the polis consisted of citizens with political rights, adult males, citizens with no political rights, women and children, and non-citizens, slaves and resident aliens. All citizens of a polis possessed rights, but these rights were coupled with responsibilities. The Greek philosopher Aristotle argued that the citizen did not just belong to himself, we must rather regard every citizen as belonging to the state. However, the loyalty that citizens had to their city-states also had a negative side. City-states distrusted one another, and the division of Greece into fiercely patriotic independent units helped bring about its ruin. A new military system, the Greek way of war. As the polis developed, so did a new military system. In earlier times, wars in Greece had been fought by aristocratic cavalry soldiers, nobles on horseback. These aristocrats, who were large landowners, also dominated the political life of their polis. But by the end of the 8th century BCE, a new military order came into being that was based on hoplites, heavily armed infantrymen who wore bronze or leather helmets, breastplates, and greaves, shin guards. Each carried a round shield, a short sword, and a thrusting spear about 9 feet long. Hoplites advanced into battle as a unit, shoulder to shoulder, forming a phalanx, a rectangular formation, in tight order, usually 8 ranks deep. As long as the hoplites kept their order, were not outflanked, and did not break, they either secured victory or, at the very least, suffered no harm. The phalanx was easily routed, however, if it broke its order. Thus, the safety of the phalanx depended above all on the solidarity and discipline of its members. As one 7th century BCE poet noted, a good hoplite was a short man firmly placed upon his legs, with a courageous heart, not to be uprooted from the spot where he plants his legs. The hoplite force had political as well as military repercussions. The aristocratic cavalry was now outdated. Since each hoplite provided his own armor, men of property, both aristocrats and small farmers, made up the new phalanx. Those who could become hoplites and fight for the state could also challenge aristocratic control. Thus, the development of the hoplite and phalanx became an important factor in the rise of democracy in Greece. In the world of the Greek city-states, war became an integral part of the Greek way of life. The Greek philosopher Plato described war as always existing by nature between every Greek city-state. The Greeks created a tradition of warfare that became a prominent element of Western civilization. For example, the Greeks devised excellent weapons and body armor, making effective use of technological improvements. Greek armies included a wide number of citizen soldiers, who gladly accepted the need for training and discipline, giving them an edge over their opponents' often far larger armies of mercenaries. Moreover, the Greeks displayed a willingness to engage the enemy head-on, thus deciding a battle quickly and with as few casualties as possible. Finally, the Greeks demonstrated the effectiveness of heavy infantry in determining the outcome of a battle. All these features of Greek warfare remain part of Western warfare for centuries. Colonization and the growth of trade. Between 750 and 550 BCE, large numbers of Greeks left their homeland to settle in distant lands. The growing gulf between rich and poor, overpopulation, and the development of trade were all factors that spurred the establishment of colonies. Each colony was founded as a polis and was usually independent of the mother polis, the metropolis, that had established it. In the western Mediterranean, new Greek settlements were established along the coastline of southern Italy, southern France, eastern Spain, and northern Africa west of Egypt. To the north, the Greeks set up colonies in Thrace, where they sought good agricultural lands to grow grains. Greeks also settled along the shores of the Black Sea and secured the approaches to it with cities on the Hellespont and Bosporus, most notably Byzantium, site of the later Constantinople, Istanbul. In establishing these settlements, the Greeks spread their culture throughout the Mediterranean basin. Moreover, colonization helped the Greeks foster a greater sense of Greek identity. Before the 8th century, Greek communities were mostly isolated from one another, and many neighboring states were on unfriendly terms. Once Greeks from different communities went abroad and found peoples with unfamiliar languages and customs, they became more aware of their own linguistic and cultural similarities. Colonization also led to increased trade and industry. The Greeks on the mainland sent their pottery, wine, and olive oil to the colonized areas. In return, they received grains and metals from the west and fish, timber, wheat, metals, and slaves from the Black Sea region. In many polis, the expansion of trade and industry created a new group of rich men who perceived that the decisions of the polis could affect their businesses. They now desired new political privileges but found them impossible to gain because of the power of the ruling aristocrats. This desire for change soon led to political crisis in many Greek states. Tyranny in the Greek polis. The aspirations of the new industrial and commercial groups laid the groundwork for the rise of tyrants in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE. They were not necessarily oppressive or wicked, as the modern English word tyrant connotes. Greek tyrants were rulers who came to power in an unconstitutional way. A tyrant was not subject to the law. Many tyrants were actually aristocrats who opposed the control of the ruling aristocratic faction in their cities. The support for the tyrants, however, came from the new rich who made their money in trade and industry, as well as from poor peasants who were becoming increasingly indebted to landholding aristocrats. Both groups were opposed to the domination of political power by aristocratic oligarchies. Oligarchy means rule by the few. Once in power, the tyrants built new marketplaces, temples, and walls that not only glorified the city but also enhanced their own popularity. Tyrants also favored the interests of merchants and traders. Despite these achievements, however, tyranny was largely extinguished by the end of the 6th century BCE. Greeks believed in the rule of law, and tyranny made a mockery of that ideal. Although tyranny did not last, it played a significant role in the evolution of Greek history by ending the rule of narrow aristocratic oligarchies. Once the tyrants were eliminated, the door was open to the participation of new and more people in governing the affairs of the community. Although this trend culminated in the development of democracy in some communities, in other states expanded oligarchies of one kind or another managed to remain in power. Greek states exhibited considerable variety in their governmental structures. This can perhaps best be seen by examining the two most famous and most powerful Greek city-states, Sparta and Athens. Sparta. Located in the southeastern Peloponnesus, Sparta, like other Greek states, faced the need for more land. Instead of sending its people out to found new colonies, the Spartans conquered the neighboring Lycaonians and later, beginning around 730 BCE, undertook the conquest of neighboring Messenia despite its larger size and population. Messenia possessed a large, fertile plain ideal for growing grain. After its conquest in the 7th century BCE, the Messenians, like the Laconians earlier, were reduced to serfdom. They were known as helots, a name derived from a Greek word for capture and forced to work for the Spartans. But the helots drastically outnumbered the Spartan citizens, some estimates are 10 to 1, and constantly threatened to revolt. To ensure control over them, the Spartans made a conscious decision to create a military state. The New Sparta. Between 800 and 600 BCE, the Spartans instituted a series of reforms that are associated with the name of the lawgiver Lycurgus. Although historians are not sure that Lycurgus ever existed, there is no doubt about the result of the reforms that were made. The lives of Spartans were now rigidly organized and tightly controlled. To this day, the word Spartan means highly self-disciplined. Boys were taken from their mothers at the age of 7 and put under control of the state. They lived in military-style barracks, where they were subjected to harsh discipline to make them tough and given an education that stressed military training and obedience to authority. At 20, Spartan males were enrolled in the army for regular military service. Although allowed to marry, they continued to live in the barracks and ate all their meals in public dining halls with their fellow soldiers. Meals were simple. The famous Spartan black broth consisted of a piece of pork boiled in blood, salt, and vinegar, causing a visitor who ate in a public mess to remark that he now understood why Spartans were not afraid to die. At 30, Spartan males were recognized as mature and allowed to vote in the assembly and live at home, but they remained in military service until the age of 60. While their husbands remained in military barracks until age 30, Spartan women lived at home. Because of this separation, Spartan women had greater freedom of movement. Permitted to own and inherit land, Spartan women had greater power in the household than was common for women elsewhere in Greece and could even supervise large estates. They were encouraged to exercise and remain fit to bear and raise healthy children. Like the men, Spartan women engaged in athletic exercises in the nude. Many Spartan women upheld the strict Spartan values, expecting their husbands and sons to be brave in war. The story is told that as a Spartan mother was burying her son, an old woman came up to her and said, "You poor woman, what a misfortune." "No," replied the mother, "because I bore him so that he might die for Sparta, and that is what has happened, as I wished." The Spartan state. The so-called Lycurgan reforms also reorganized the Spartan government, creating an oligarchy. 2 kings from different families were primarily responsible for military affairs and served as the leaders of the Spartan army on its campaigns. A group of 5 men, known as the ephors, were elected each year and were responsible for the education of youth and the conduct of all citizens. A council of elders, composed of the 2 kings and 28 male citizens over the age of 60, decided on the issues that would be presented to an assembly. This assembly of all male citizens did not debate but only voted on the proposals put before it by the Council of Elders. The assembly also elected the Council of Elders and the ephors. To make their new military state secure, the Spartans deliberately turned their backs on the outside world. Foreigners, who might bring in new ideas, were discouraged from visiting Sparta. Nor were Spartans, except for military reasons, allowed to travel abroad, where they might pick up new ideas dangerous to the stability of the state. Likewise, Spartan citizens were discouraged from studying philosophy, literature, or the arts subjects that might encourage new thoughts. The art of war was the Spartan ideal, and all other arts were frowned on. In the 6th century, Sparta used its military might and the fear it inspired to gain greater control of the Peloponnesus by organizing an alliance of almost all the Peloponnesian states. Sparta's strength enabled it to dominate this Peloponnesian league and determine its policies. By 500 BCE, the Spartans had organized a powerful military state that maintained order and stability in the Peloponnesus. Raised from early childhood to believe that total loyalty to the Spartan state was the basic reason for existence, the Spartans viewed their strength as justification for their militaristic ideals and regimented society. Athens. By 700 BCE, Athens had established a unified polis on the peninsula of Attica. Although early Athens had been ruled by a monarchy, by the 7th century BCE it had fallen under the control of its aristocrats. They possessed the best land and controlled political and religious life by means of a council of nobles, assisted by a board of 9 officials called archons. Although there was an assembly of full citizens, it possessed few powers. Near the end of the 7th century BCE, Athens faced political turmoil because of serious economic problems. Increasing numbers of Athenian farmers found themselves sold into slavery when they were unable to repay loans they had obtained from their aristocratic neighbors, pledging themselves as collateral. Repeatedly, there were cries to cancel the debts and give land to the poor. The reforms of Solon. The ruling Athenian aristocrats responded to this crisis by choosing Solon, a reform-minded aristocrat, as sole archon in 594 BCE and giving him full power to make changes. Solon cancelled all land debts, outlawed new loans based on humans as collateral, and freed people who had fallen into slavery for debts. He refused, however, to carry out land redistribution and hence failed to deal with the basic cause of the economic crisis. Like his economic reforms, Solon's political measures were also a compromise. Though by no means eliminating the power of the aristocracy, they opened the door to the participation of new people, especially the non-aristocratic wealthy, in the government. But Solon's reforms, though popular, did not solve Athens's problems. Aristocratic factions continued to vie for power, and the poorer peasants resented Solon's failure to institute land redistribution. Internal strife finally led to the very institution Solon had hoped to avoid: tyranny. Pisistratus, an aristocrat, seized power in 560 BCE pursuing a foreign policy that aided Athenian trade. Pisistratus remained popular with the mercantile and industrial classes. But the Athenians rebelled against his son and ended the tyranny in 510 BCE. Although the aristocrats attempted to re-establish an aristocratic oligarchy, Clisthenes, another aristocratic reformer, opposed this plan and, with the backing of the Athenian people, gained the upper hand in 508 BCE. The reforms of Clisthenes. Clisthenes created the Council of 500. Chosen by lot by the 10 tribes in which all citizens had been enrolled. The council was responsible for the administration of both foreign and financial affairs and prepared the business that would be handled by the assembly. This assembly of all male citizens had final authority in the passing of laws after free and open debate. Thus, Clisthenes's reforms had reinforced the central role of the assembly of citizens in the Athenian political system. The reforms of Clisthenes created the foundations for Athenian democracy. More changes would come in the 5th century, when the Athenians themselves would begin to use the word democracy to describe their system, from the Greek words demos, people, and kratia, power. By 500 BCE, Athens was more united than it had been and was on the verge of playing a more important role in Greek affairs. Foreign influence on early Greek culture. As the Greeks moved out into the eastern Mediterranean, they came into increased contact with the older civilizations of the Near East and Egypt, which had a strong impact on early Greek culture. The Greeks adopted new gods and goddesses as well as new myths such as the story of the flood from Mesopotamian traditions. Greek pottery in the 8th and 7th centuries began to use new motifs such as floral designs borrowed from the Near East. Greek sculpture, particularly that of the Ionian Greek settlements in southwestern Asia Minor, demonstrates the impact of the considerably older Egyptian civilization. There we first see the life-size stone statues of young male nudes known as crow's figures. The crows bears a strong resemblance to Egyptian statues of the New Kingdom. The figures are not realistic but stiff, the face bearing the hint of a smile, one leg is advanced ahead of the other, and the arms are held rigidly at the sides of the body. Greek literature was also the beneficiary of a Greek alphabet that owed much to the Phoenicians. The Greeks adopted some of the 22 Phoenician consonants as Greek consonants and used other symbols to represent vowel sounds, which the Phoenicians did not have. In the process, the Greeks created a truly phonetic alphabet, probably between 800 and 750 BCE, thus making the Greek language easier to read and write than Egyptian hieroglyphics and Mesopotamian cuneiform. Greek could be used to record laws and commercial transactions and to write the poetry, philosophical treatises, and other literary works that distinguish Greek culture. The high point of Greek civilization, classical Greece. Focus questions: what did the Greeks mean by democracy, and in what ways was the Athenian political system a democracy? What effect did the two great conflicts of the 5th century, the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War, have on Greek civilization? Classical Greece is the name given to the period of Greek history from around 500 BCE to the conquest of Greece by the Macedonian king Philip II in 338 BCE. Many of the cultural contributions of the Greeks occurred during this period. The age began with a mighty confrontation between the Greek states and the mammoth Persian Empire. The challenge of Persia. As the Greeks spread throughout the Mediterranean, they came into contact with the Persian Empire to the east. In his play The Persians, the Greek playwright Aeschylus reflected what some Greeks perceived to be the essential difference between themselves and the Persians. The Persian queen, curious to find out more about the Athenians, asks, "Who commands them? Who is shepherd of their host?" The chorus responds, "They are slaves to none, nor are they subject." Thus, at least, some Greeks saw the struggle with the Persians as a contest between freedom and slavery. To the Greeks, a person was a citizen of the state, not a subject. The Ionian Greek cities in Western Asia Minor had already fallen subject to the Persian Empire by the mid-6th century BCE. An unsuccessful revolt by the Ionian cities in 499 BCE, assisted by the Athenian navy, led the Persian ruler Darius to seek revenge by attacking the mainland Greeks. In 490 BCE, the Persians landed an army on the plain of Marathon, only 26 miles from Athens. The Athenians and their allies were clearly outnumbered, but led by Miltiades, one of the Athenian leaders who insisted on attacking, the Greek hoplites charged across the plain of Marathon and crushed the Persian forces. Xerxes, the new Persian monarch after the death of Darius in 486 BCE, vowed revenge and planned to invade. In preparation for the attack, some of the Greek states formed a defensive league under Spartan leadership. The Athenians, in the meantime, had acquired a new leader, Themistocles, who persuaded his fellow citizens to pursue a new military policy, namely, the development of a navy. By the time of the Persian invasion in 480 BCE, the Athenians had produced a fleet of about 200 vessels, primarily triremes, ships with 3 banks of oars. Xerxes led a massive invasion force into Greece, close to 150,000 troops, almost 700 naval ships, and hundreds of supply ships to keep the large army fed. The Greeks tried to delay the Persians at the pass of Thermopylae, along the main road into central Greece. A Greek force numbering close to 9,000, under the leadership of the Spartan king, Leonidas, and his contingent of 300 Spartans, held off the Persian army for 2 days. The Spartan troops were especially brave. When told that Persian arrows would darken the sky in battle, one Spartan warrior supposedly responded, "That is good news. We will fight in the shade." Unfortunately for the Greeks, a traitor told the Persians how to use a mountain path to outflank the Greek force. The Spartans fought to the last man. The Athenians, now threatened by the onslaught of the Persian forces, abandoned their city. While the Persians sacked and burned Athens, the Greek fleet remained offshore near the island of Salamis and challenged the Persian navy to fight. Although the Greeks were outnumbered, they managed to outmaneuver the Persian fleet and utterly defeated it. A few months later, early in 479 BCE, the Greeks formed the largest Greek army seen up to that time and decisively defeated the Persian army at Plataea, northwest of Attica. The Greeks had won the war and were now free to pursue their own destiny. The growth of an Athenian empire in the age of Pericles. After the defeat of the Persians, Athens took over the leadership of the Greek world by forming a defensive alliance against the Persians called the Delian League in the winter of 478 to 477 BCE. Its main headquarters was on the island of Delos, but its chief officials, including the treasurers and commanders of the fleet, were Athenian. Under the leadership of the Athenians, the Delian League pursued the attack against the Persian Empire. Virtually all of the Greek states in the Aegean were liberated from Persian control. Arguing that the Persian threat was now over, some members of the Delian League wished to withdraw, but the Athenians forced them to remain in the league and to pay tribute. In 454 BCE, the Athenians moved the treasury of the league from Delos to Athens. By controlling the Delian League, Athens had created an empire. At home, Athenians favored the new imperial policy, especially after 461 BCE, when politics came to be dominated by a political faction led by a young aristocrat named Pericles. Under Pericles, who remained a leading figure in Athenian politics for more than 3 decades, Athens embarked on a policy of expanding democracy at home and its new empire abroad. This period of Athenian and Greek history, which historians have subsequently labeled the Age of Pericles, witnessed the height of Athenian power and the culmination of its brilliance as a civilization. During the Age of Pericles, the Athenians became deeply attached to their democratic system. The sovereignty of the people was embodied in the assembly, which consisted of all male citizens over 18 years of age. In the 440s, that was probably a group of about 43,000. Not all attended, however, and the number present at the meetings, which were held every 10 days on a hillside east of the Acropolis, seldom reached 6,000. The assembly passed all laws and made final decisions on war and foreign policy. Routine administration of public affairs was handled by a large body of city magistrates, usually chosen by lot without regard to class and usually serving only 1-year terms. This meant that many male citizens held public office at some time in their lives. A board of 10 officials known as generals was elected by public vote to guide affairs of state, although their power depended on the respect they had earned. Generals were usually wealthy aristocrats, even though the people were free to select otherwise. The generals could be re-elected, enabling individual leaders to play an important political role. Pericles' frequent re-election, 15 times, as one of the 10 generals made him one of the leading politicians between 461 and 429 BCE. Pericles expanded the Athenians' involvement in democracy, which is what by now the Athenians had come to call their form of government. See the box Athenian democracy, the funeral oration of Pericles above. Power was in the hands of the people. Male citizens voted in the assemblies and served as jurors in the courts. Lower-class citizens were now eligible for public offices formerly closed to them. Pericles also introduced state pay for office holders, including the widely held jury duty. This meant that even poor citizens could afford to participate in public affairs and hold public office. Nevertheless, although the Athenians developed a system of government that was unique in its time, in which citizens had equal rights and the people were the government, aristocrats continued to hold the most important offices, and many people, including women, slaves, and foreigners residing in Athens, were not given the same political rights. Under Pericles, Athens became the leading center of Greek culture. The Persians had destroyed much of the city during the Persian Wars, but Pericles used the treasury money of the Delian League to set in motion a massive rebuilding program. New temples and statues soon made the greatness of Athens more visible. Art, architecture, and philosophy flourished, and Pericles broadly boasted that Athens had become the school of Greece. But the achievements of Athens alarmed the other Greek states, especially Sparta, and soon all of Greece was confronting a new war. The Great Peloponnesian War and the decline of the Greek states. During the 40 years after the defeat of the Persians, the Greek world came to be divided into two major camps, Sparta and its supporters and the Athenian Maritime Empire. Sparta and its allies feared the growing Athenian Empire. Then, too, Athens and Sparta had created two very different kinds of societies, and neither state was able to tolerate the other's system. A series of disputes finally led to the outbreak of war in 431 BCE. At the beginning of the war, both sides believed they had winning strategies. The Athenians planned to remain behind the protective walls of Athens while the overseas empire and the navy would keep them supplied. Pericles knew that the Spartans and their allies could beat the Athenians in open battles, which was the chief aim of the Spartan strategy. The Spartans and their allies invaded Attica and ravaged the fields and orchards, hoping that the Athenians would send out their army to fight beyond the walls. But Pericles was convinced that Athens was secure behind its walls and stayed put. In the second year of the war, however, plague devastated the crowded city of Athens and wiped out possibly one-third of the population. Pericles himself died the following year, 429 BCE, a severe loss to Athens. Despite the losses from the plague, the Athenians fought on in a struggle that dragged on for another 27 years. A final crushing blow came in 405 BCE, when the Athenian fleet was destroyed at Aegospotami on the Hellespont. Athens was besieged and surrendered in 404. Its walls were torn down, the navy was disbanded, and the Athenian Empire was no more. The Great War was finally over. The Great Peloponnesian War weakened the major Greek states and destroyed any possibility of cooperation among the states. The next 70 years of Greek history are a sorry tale of efforts by Sparta, Athens, and Thebes, a new Greek power, to dominate Greek affairs. Focused on their petty wars, the Greek states remained oblivious to the growing power of Macedonia to their north. The culture of Classical Greece. Classical Greece was a period of remarkable intellectual and cultural growth throughout the Greek world, and Periclean Athens was the most important center of classical Greek culture. The writing of history. History as we know it, as the systematic analysis of past events, was introduced to the Western world by the Greeks. Herodotus, c. 484 to c. 425 BCE, wrote History of the Persian Wars, which is commonly regarded as the first real history in Western civilization. The central theme of Herodotus's work was the conflict between the Greeks and the Persians, which he viewed as a struggle between freedom and despotism. Herodotus traveled extensively and questioned many people to obtain his information. He was a master storyteller and sometimes included considerable fanciful material, but he was also capable of exhibiting a critical attitude toward the materials he used. Thucydides, c. 460 to c. 400 BCE, was a better historian by far. Indeed, he is considered the greatest historian of the ancient world. Thucydides was an Athenian and a participant in the Peloponnesian War. He had been elected a general, but a defeat in battle led the fickle Athenian assembly to send him into exile, which gave him the opportunity to write his history of the Peloponnesian War. Unlike Herodotus, Thucydides was not concerned with underlying divine forces or gods as explanatory causal factors in history. He saw war and politics in purely rational terms, as the activities of human beings. He examined the causes of the Peloponnesian War in a clear, methodical, objective fashion, placing much emphasis on accuracy and the precision of his facts. As he stated, with regard to my factual reporting of the events of the war, one have made it a principle not to write down the first story that came my way, and not even to be guided by my own general impressions. Either I was present myself at the events which I have described, or else I heard of them from my witnesses whose reports I have checked with as much thoroughness as possible. Thucydides also provided remarkable insight into the human condition. He believed that political situations recur in similar fashion, and that the study of history is therefore of great value in understanding the present. Greek drama. Drama as we know it in Western culture was originated by the Greeks. Plays were presented in outdoor theaters as part of religious festivals. The plays followed a fairly stable form. 3 male actors who wore masks acted all the parts. A chorus, also male, spoke lines that explained what was going on. Action was very limited because the emphasis was on the story and its meaning. The first Greek dramas were tragedies, plays based on the suffering of a hero and usually ending in disaster. Aeschylus, 525 to 456 BCE, is the first tragedian whose plays are known to us. As was customary in Greek tragedy, his plots are simple, and the entire drama focuses on a single tragic event and its meaning. Greek tragedies were sometimes presented in a trilogy, a set of 3 plays, built around a common theme. The only complete trilogy we possess, called the Oesta, was written by Aeschylus. The theme of this trilogy is derived from Homer. Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, returns a hero from the defeat of Troy. His wife, Clytemnestra, avenges the sacrificial death of her daughter Iphigenia by murdering Agamemnon, who had been responsible for Iphigenia's death. In the second play of the trilogy, Agamemnon's son Orestes avenges his father by killing his mother. Orestes is then pursued by the avenging Furies, who torment him for killing his mother. Evil acts breed evil acts, and suffering is one's lot, suggests Aeschylus. But Orestes is put on trial and acquitted by Athena, the patron goddess of Athens. Personal vendetta has been eliminated, and law has prevailed. The most successful writer of Greek tragedies was the Athenian playwright Sophocles, c. 496 to 406 BCE, whose most famous work was Oedipus the King. In this play, the oracle of Apollo foretells that a man, Oedipus, will kill his own father and marry his mother. Despite all attempts at prevention, the tragic events occur. Although it appears that Oedipus suffered the fate determined by the gods, Oedipus also accepts that he himself as a free man must bear responsibility for his actions. It was Apollo, friends, Apollo, that brought this bitterness, my sorrows to completion. But the hand that struck me was none but my own. In Antigone, the daughter of Oedipus is caught in the dilemma of following her religious obligations to bury the body of her brother Polynices, who has died in an attempt to seize the throne of Thebes. Antigone's uncle, Cleon, the king of Thebes, however, has forbidden his burial as a traitor to the state. Should Antigone adhere to her principles and fulfill her obligation to the gods by burying her brother, or face death by defying the authority of the state? In this confrontation between Cleon and Antigone, Sophocles bears witness to the complexity of human existence. Another outstanding Athenian tragedian, Euripides, c. 485 to 406 BCE, moved beyond his predecessors by creating more realistic characters. His plots also became more complex, with a greater interest in real-life situations. Euripides was controversial because he questioned traditional moral and religious values. For example, he was critical of the traditional view that war was glorious. Instead, he portrayed war as brutal and barbaric. Greek tragedies dealt with universal themes still relevant to our day. They probed such problems as the nature of good and evil, the rights of the individual, the nature of divine forces, and the nature of human beings. Over and over, the tragic lesson was repeated: Humans were free and yet could operate only within limitations imposed by the gods. Striving to do the best may not always gain a person success in human terms but is nevertheless worthy of the endeavor. Greek pride in human accomplishment and independence was real. As the chorus chants in Sophocles' Antigone, "Is there anything more wonderful on earth, our marvelous planet, than the miracle of man?" Greek comedy developed later than tragedy. The plays of Aristophanes, c. 450 to c. 385 BCE, who used both grotesque masks and obscene jokes to entertain the Athenian audience, are examples of old comedy. But comedy in Athens was also more clearly political than tragedy. It was used to attack or savagely satirize both politicians and intellectuals. Of special importance to Aristophanes was his opposition to the Peloponnesian War. The arts, the classical ideal. The artistic standards established by the Greeks of the classical period have largely dominated the arts of the Western world. Greek art was concerned with expressing eternally true ideals. Its subject matter was basically the human being, expressed harmoniously as an object of great beauty. The classical style, based on the ideals of reason, moderation, symmetry, balance, and harmony in all things, was meant to civilize the emotions. In architecture, the most important form was the temple dedicated to a god or goddess. At the center of Greek temples were walled rooms that housed the statues of deities and treasuries in which gifts to the gods and goddesses were safeguarded. These central rooms were surrounded by a screen of columns that made Greek temples open structures rather than closed ones. The columns were originally made of wood but were changed to marble in the 5th century BCE. Some of the finest examples of Greek classical architecture were built in 5th century Athens. The most famous building, regarded as the finest example of the classical Greek temple, was the Parthenon, built between 447 and 432 BCE, consecrated to Athena, the patron goddess of Athens. The Parthenon was also dedicated to the glory of the city-state and its inhabitants. The Parthenon typifies the principles of classical architecture: calmness, clarity, and the avoidance of superfluous detail. Greek sculpture developed a classical style that differed significantly from the artificial stiffness of the figures of earlier times, which had been influenced by Egyptian sculpture. Statues of the male nude, the favorite subject of Greek sculptors, now exhibited more relaxed attitudes. Their faces were self-assured, their bodies flexible and smooth-muscled. Although the figures possessed natural features that made them lifelike, Greek sculptors sought to achieve not realism but a standard of ideal beauty. Polykleitos, a 5th century sculptor, wrote a treatise, now lost, on a canon of proportions that he illustrated in a work known as the Doryphores. His theory maintained that the use of ideal proportions, based on mathematical ratios found in nature, could produce an ideal human form, beautiful in its perfected and refined features. This search for ideal beauty was the dominant feature of the classical standard in sculpture. The Greek love of wisdom. Philosophy is a Greek word that originally meant love of wisdom. Early Greek philosophers were concerned with the development of critical or rational thought about the nature of the universe and the place of divine forces and souls in it. Much of early Greek philosophy focused on the attempt to explain the universe on the basis of unifying principles. Many Greeks, however, were simply not interested in such speculations. The Sophists were a group of philosophical teachers in the 5th century BCE who rejected such speculation as foolish. Like their near contemporary Confucius in China, they argued that understanding the universe was beyond the reach of the human mind. See the comparative essay The Axial Age above. It was more important for individuals to improve themselves, so the only worthwhile object of study was human behavior. The Sophists were wandering scholars who sold their services as professional teachers to the young men of Greece, especially those of Athens. The Sophists stressed the importance of rhetoric, the art of persuasive oratory, in winning debates and swaying an audience, a skill that was especially valuable in democratic Athens. Unlike Confucius, however, the sophists tended to be skeptics who questioned the traditional values of their societies. To the sophists, there was no absolute right or wrong. True wisdom consisted of being able to perceive and pursue one's own good. Many people, however, viewed the sophists as harmful to society and considered their ideas especially dangerous to the values of young people. In classical Greece, Athens became the foremost intellectual and artistic center. Its reputation is perhaps strongest of all in philosophy. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle raised basic questions that have been debated for 2000 years, for the most part the very same philosophical questions we wrestle with today. Socrates, 469 to 399 BCE, left no writings, but we know about him from his pupils. Socrates was a stonemason whose true love was philosophy. He taught in numbers of pupils, but not for pay, because he believed that the goal of education was to improve the individual. His approach, still known as the Socratic method, employs a question-and-answer technique to lead pupils to see things for themselves using their own reason. Socrates believed that all knowledge is within each person, only critical examination was needed to call it forth. This was the real task of philosophy, since the unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates questioned authority and criticized some traditional Athenian values, and this soon led him into trouble. Athens had had a tradition of free thought and inquiry, but its defeat in the Peloponnesian War had created an environment intolerant of open debate and soul-searching. Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens by his teaching. An Athenian jury convicted him and sentenced him to death. One of Socrates' disciples was Plato, c. 429 to 347 BCE, considered by many the greatest philosopher of Western civilization. Unlike his master Socrates, who wrote nothing, Plato wrote a great deal. He was fascinated with the question of reality. How do we know what is real? According to Plato, a higher world of eternal, unchanging ideas or forms has always existed. To know these forms is to know truth. These ideal forms constitute reality and can be apprehended only by a trained mind, which, of course, is the goal of philosophy. The objects that we perceive with our senses are simply reflections of the ideal forms. They are shadows. Reality is in the forms themselves. Plato's ideas of government were set out in his dialogue titled The Republic. Based on his experience in Athens, Plato had come to distrust the workings of democracy. It was obvious to him that individuals could not attain an ethical life unless they lived in a just and rational state. In the Republic, he constructed such an ideal state, in which the population was divided into three basic groups. At the top was an upper class, a ruling elite, the philosopher kings. Unless political power and philosophy meet together, there can be no rest from troubles. For states, nor yet, as I believe, for all mankind. The second group consisted of the courageous. They would be the warriors who protected the society. All the rest made up the masses, essentially people driven not by wisdom or courage but by desire. They would be the producers, the artisans, tradespeople, and farmers. Contrary to common Greek custom, Plato also believed that men and women should have the same education and equal access to all positions. Plato established a school at Athens known as the Academy. One of his pupils, who studied there for 20 years, was Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, who later became a tutor to Alexander the Great. Aristotle did not accept Plato's theory of ideal forms. Instead, he believed that by examining individual objects, we can perceive their form and arrive at universal principles, but these principles do not exist as a separate higher world of reality beyond material things, rather they are a part of things themselves. Aristotle's interests, then, lay in analyzing and classifying things based on thorough research and investigation. His interests were wide-ranging, and he wrote treatises on an enormous number of subjects: ethics, logic, politics, poetry, astronomy, geology, biology, and physics. Like Plato, Aristotle wished for an effective form of government that would rationally direct human affairs. Unlike Plato, he did not seek an ideal state based on the embodiment of an ideal form of justice but tried to find the best form of government by a rational examination of existing governments. For his politics, Aristotle examined the constitutions of 158 states and arrived at general categories for organizing governments. He identified three good forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and constitutional government. But based on his examination, he warned that monarchy can easily turn into tyranny, aristocracy into oligarchy, and constitutional government into radical democracy or anarchy. He favored constitutional government as the best form for most people. Aristotle's philosophical and political ideas played an enormous role in the development of Western thought during the Middle Ages. So did his ideas on women. Aristotle maintained that women were biologically inferior to men. A woman is, as it were, an infertile male. She is female in fact on account of a kind of inadequacy. Therefore, according to Aristotle, women must be subordinated to men, not only in the community but also in marriage. The association between husband and wife is clearly an aristocracy. The man rules by virtue of merit, and in the sphere that is his by right, but he hands over to his wife such matters as are suitable for her. Greek religion. As was the case throughout the ancient world, religion played an important role in Greek society and was intricately connected to every aspect of daily life. It was both social and practical. Public festivals, which originated from religious practices, served specific functions. Boys were prepared to be warriors, girls to be mothers. Because religion was related to every aspect of life, citizens had to have a proper attitude toward the gods. Religion was a civic cult necessary for the well-being of the state. Temples dedicated to a god or goddess were the major buildings in Greek cities. The poetry of Homer gave an account of the gods that provided Greek religion with a definite structure. Over a period of time, all Greeks came to accept a basic polytheistic religion with 12 chief gods who supposedly lived on Mount Olympus, the highest mountain in Greece. Among the 12 were Zeus, the chief deity and father of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom and crafts; Apollo, god of the sun and poetry; Aphrodite, goddess of love; and Poseidon, brother of Zeus and god of the seas and earthquakes. Although the 12 Olympian gods were common to all Greeks, each polis usually singled out one of the 12 as a guardian deity for the community. Athena was the patron goddess of Athens, for example. Because the Greeks wanted the gods to look favorably on their activities, ritual assumed enormous proportions in Greek religion. Prayers were often combined with gifts to the gods based on the principle I give so that you, the gods, will give in return. Ritual meant sacrifices, whether of animals or agricultural products. Animal sacrifices were burned on an altar in front of a temple or on a small altar in front of a home. As another practical side of Greek religion, Greeks wanted to know the will of the gods. To do so, they made use of the oracle, a sacred shrine dedicated to a god or goddess who revealed the future. The most famous was the Oracle of Apollo at Delphi, located on the side of Mount Parnassus, overlooking the Gulf of Corinth. At Delphi, a priestess listened to questions while in a state of ecstasy that was believed to be induced by Apollo. Her responses were interpreted by the priests and given in verse form to the person asking questions. Representatives of states and individuals traveled to Delphi to consult the Oracle of Apollo. States might inquire whether they should undertake a military expedition. Individuals might raise such questions as Heraclitus asks whether he will have offspring from the wife he has now. Responses were often enigmatic and at times even politically motivated. Croesus, the king of Lydia in Asia Minor, who was known for his incredible wealth, sent messengers to the oracle at Delphi, asking whether he should go to war with the Persians. The oracle replied that if Croesus attacked the Persians, he would destroy a mighty empire. Overjoyed to hear these words, Croesus made war on the Persians but was crushed. A mighty empire was indeed destroyed, his own. Festivals also developed as a way to honor the gods and goddesses. Some of these, the Pan-Hellenic celebrations, came to have international significance and were held at special locations, such as those dedicated to the worship of Zeus at Olympia or to Apollo at Delphi. The great festivals incorporated numerous events in honor of the gods, including athletic competitions to which all Greeks were invited. According to tradition, such athletic games were first held at the Olympic festival in 776 BCE and then held every 4 years thereafter to honor Zeus. Initially, the Olympic contests consisted of foot races and wrestling, but later boxing, javelin throwing, and various other contests were added. Competitions were always between individuals, not groups. The Greeks looked upon winning athletes as great heroes and often rewarded them with parades, as well as money and free rents for life. Olympic Games were not without danger to the participants. Athletes competed in the nude, and rules were rather relaxed. Wrestlers, for example, were allowed to gouge eyes and even pick up their competitors and bring them down headfirst onto a hard surface. Boxers wrapped their hands and forearms with heavy leather thongs, making their blows damaging. Some athletes were killed during the games. Given the hatred that often existed between city-states in ancient Greece, their deaths were not always accidental. The Greek Olympic Games came to an end in 393 CE, when a Christian Roman emperor banned them as pagan exercises. 1500 years later, the games were revived through the efforts of a French baron, Pierre de Coubertin. In 1896, the first modern Olympic Games were held in Athens, Greece. Life in classical Athens. The polis was above all a male community, only adult male citizens took part in public life. In Athens, this meant the exclusion of women, slaves, and foreign residents, or roughly 85% of the total population in Attica. There were probably 150,000 citizens in Athens, of whom about 43,000 were adult males who exercised political power. Resident foreigners, who numbered about 35,000, received the protection of the laws but were also subject to some of the responsibilities of citizens, namely, military service and the funding of festivals. The remaining social group, the slaves, numbered around 100,000. Most slaves in Athens worked in the home as cooks and maids or toiled in the fields. Some were owned by the state and worked on public construction projects. Economy and lifestyle. The Athenian economy was based largely on agriculture and trade. Athenians grew grains, vegetables, and fruit for local consumption. Grapes and olives were cultivated for wine and olive oil, which were used locally and also exported. The Athenians raised sheep and goats for wool and dairy products. Because of the size of the population in Attica and the lack of abundant fertile land, Athens had to import 50 to 80% of its grain, a staple in the Athenian diet. Trade was thus very important to the Athenian economy. Perhaps that is one reason why the Greeks were among the first to mint silver coins. The Athenian lifestyle was basically simple. Athenian houses were furnished with necessities bought from artisans, such as beds, couches, tables, chests, pottery, stools, baskets, and cooking utensils. Wives and slaves made clothes and blankets at home. The Athenian diet was rather plain and relied on such basic foods as barley, wheat, millet, lentils, grapes, figs, olives, almonds, bread made at home, vegetables, eggs, fish, cheese, and chicken. Olive oil was widely used, not only for eating but also for burning in lamps and rubbing on the body after washing and exercise. Although country houses kept animals, they were used for reasons other than their flesh: oxen for plowing, sheep for wool, and goats for milk and cheese. Family and relationships. The family was a central institution in ancient Athens. It was composed of husband, wife, and children, a nuclear family, although other dependent relatives and slaves were regarded as part of the family economic unit. The family's primary social function was to produce new citizens. Strict laws enacted in the 5th century stipulated that a citizen must be the offspring of a legally acknowledged marriage between two Athenian citizens whose parents were also citizens. Adult female citizens could participate in most religious cults and festivals but were otherwise excluded from public life. They could not own property beyond personal items and always had a male guardian. An Athenian woman was expected to be a good wife. Her foremost obligation was to bear children, especially male children who would preserve the family line. A wife was also to take care of her family and her house, either doing the household work herself or supervising the slaves who did the actual work. Women were kept under strict control. Because they were married at 14 or 15, they were taught about their responsibilities at an early age. Although many managed to learn to read and play musical instruments, they were not given any formal education. And women were expected to remain at home out of sight unless attending funerals or festivals. If they left the house, they were to be accompanied. A woman working alone in public was either poverty-stricken or not a citizen. Male homosexuality was also a prominent feature of Athenian life. The Greek homosexual ideal was a relationship between a mature man and a young male. It is most likely that this was an aristocratic ideal and not one practiced by the common people. While the relationship was frequently physical, the Greeks also viewed it as educational. The older male, the lover, won the love of his beloved through his value as a teacher and the devotion he demonstrated in training his charge. In a sense, this love relationship was seen as a way of initiating young males into the male world of political and military dominance. The Greeks did not feel that the coexistence of homosexual and heterosexual predilections created any special problems for individuals or their society. The rise of Macedonia and the conquests of Alexander. Focus question: how was Alexander the Great able to amass his empire, and what was his legacy? While the Greek city-states were continuing to fight each other, to their north a new and ultimately powerful kingdom was emerging in its own right. Its people, the Macedonians, were mostly rural folk, organized in tribes, not city-states, and were viewed as barbarians by their southern neighbors, the Greeks. Not until the end of the 5th century BCE did Macedonia emerge as an important kingdom. But when Philip II, 359 to 336 BCE, came to the throne, he built an efficient army and turned Macedonia into the strongest power of the Greek world, one that was soon drawn into the conflicts among the Greeks. The Athenians at last took notice of the new contender. Fear of Philip led them to ally with a number of other Greek states and confront the Macedonians at the Battle of Chaeronea, near Thebes. In 338 BCE the Macedonian army crushed the Greeks, and Philip was now free to consolidate his control over the Greek peninsula. The Greek states were joined together in an alliance that we call the Corinthian League because they met at Corinth. All members took an oath of loyalty. I swear by Zeus, Earth, Sun, Poseidon, Athena, Ares, and all the gods and goddesses. I will abide by the peace, and I will not break the agreements with Philip the Macedonian, nor will I take up arms with hostile intent against any one of those who abide by the oaths either by land or by sea. Philip insisted that the Greek states end their bitter rivalries and cooperate with him in a war against Persia. Before Philip could undertake his invasion of Asia, however, he was assassinated, leaving the task to his son Alexander. Alexander the Great. Alexander was only 20 when he became king of Macedonia. He had in many ways been prepared to rule by his father, who had taken Alexander along on military campaigns and had given him control of the cavalry at the important Battle of Chaeronea. After his father's assassination, Alexander moved quickly to assert his authority, securing the Macedonian frontiers and smothering a rebellion in Greece. He then turned to his father's dream, the invasion of the Persian Empire. Alexander's conquests. There is no doubt that Alexander was taking a chance in attacking the Persian Empire, which was still a strong state. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander entered Asia Minor with an army of 37,000 men. About half were Macedonians, the rest Greeks and other allies. The cavalry, which would play an important role as a strike force, numbered about 5,000. Alexander's first confrontation with the Persians, at a battle at the Granicus River in 334 BCE, almost cost him his life but resulted in a major victory. By the following spring, the entire western half of Asia Minor was in Alexander's hands. Meanwhile, the Persian king, Darius III, mobilized his forces to stop Alexander's army. Although the Persian troops outnumbered Alexander's, the Battle of Issus was fought on a narrow field that cancelled the advantage of superior numbers and resulted in another Macedonian success. After his victory at Issus in 333 BCE, Alexander turned south, and by the winter of 332, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt were under his domination. He took the traditional title of Pharaoh of Egypt and founded the first of a series of cities named after him, Alexandria, as the Greek administrative capital of Egypt. It became, and remains today, one of the most important cities in Egypt and in the Mediterranean world. In 331 BCE, Alexander renewed his offensive, moved into the territory of the ancient Mesopotamian kingdoms, and fought a decisive battle with the Persians at Gaugamela, northwest of Babylon. After his victory, Alexander entered Babylon and then proceeded to the Persian capitals at Susa and Persepolis, where he acquired the Persian treasuries and took possession of vast quantities of gold and silver. By 330, Alexander was again on the march, pursuing Darius. After Darius was killed by one of his own men, Alexander took the title and office of Great King of the Persians. But Alexander was not content to rest with the spoils of the Persian Empire. Over the next 3 years, he moved east and northeast, as far as modern Pakistan. By the summer of 327 BCE, he had entered India, which at that time was divided into a number of warring states. In 326 BCE, Alexander and his armies arrived in the plains of northwestern India. At the Battle of the Hydaspes River, Alexander won a brutally fought battle. When Alexander made clear his determination to march east to conquer more of India, his soldiers, weary of campaigning year after year, mutinied and refused to go on. Reluctantly, Alexander turned back, leading his men across the arid lands of southern Persia. Conditions in the desert were appalling, the blazing sun and lack of water led to thousands of deaths before Alexander and his remaining troops reached Babylon. Alexander planned still more campaigns, but in June 323 BCE, weakened from wounds, fever, and probably excessive alcohol consumption, he died at the age of 32. The legacy: was Alexander great? Alexander is one of the most puzzling significant figures in history. Historians relying on the same sources draw vastly different pictures of him. For some, his military ability, extensive conquests, and creation of a new empire alone justify calling him Alexander the Great. Other historians also praise Alexander's love of Greek culture and his intellectual brilliance, especially in matters of warfare. In the lands that he conquered, Alexander attempted to fuse the Macedonians, Greeks, and Persians into a new ruling class. Did he do this because he was an idealistic visionary who believed in a concept of universal humanity, as some suggest? Or was he merely trying to bolster his power and create an autocratic monarchy? Those historians who see Alexander as aspiring to autocratic monarchy present a very different portrait of him as a ruthless Machiavellian. One has titled his biography Alexander the Great Failure. These critics ask whether a man who slaughtered indigenous peoples, who risked the lives of his soldiers for his own selfish reasons, whose fierce temper led him to kill his friends, and whose neglect of administrative duties weakened his kingdom can really be called great. But how did Alexander view himself? We know that he sought to imitate Achilles, the warrior hero of Homer's Iliad. Alexander kept a copy of the Iliad and a dagger under his pillow. He also claimed to be descended from Heracles, the Greek hero who came to be worshipped as a god. Regardless of his ideals, motives, or views about himself, one fact stands out: Alexander ushered in a completely new age, the Hellenistic era. The word Hellenistic is derived from a Greek word meaning to imitate Greeks. It is an appropriate way, then, to describe an age that saw the extension of the Greek language and ideas to the non-Greek world of the Middle East. Alexander's destruction of the Persian monarchy created opportunities for Greek engineers, intellectuals, merchants, soldiers, and administrators. Those who followed Alexander and his successors participated in a new political unity based on the principle of monarchy. His successors used force to establish military monarchies that dominated the Hellenistic world after his death. Autocratic power became a regular feature of those Hellenistic monarchies and was part of Alexander's political legacy to the Hellenistic world. His vision of empire no doubt inspired the Romans, who were, of course, Alexander's real heirs. But Alexander also left a cultural legacy. As a result of his conquests, Greek language, art, architecture, and literature spread throughout the Middle East. The urban centers of the Hellenistic age, many founded by Alexander and his successors, became springboards for the diffusion of Greek culture. While the Greeks spread their culture in the East, they were also inevitably influenced by Eastern ways. Thus, Alexander's legacy included one of the basic characteristics of the Hellenistic world, the clash and fusion of different cultures. The world of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Focus question: how did the political, economic, and social institutions of the Hellenistic world differ from those of classical Greece? The united empire that Alexander created by his conquests disintegrated after his death. All too soon, Macedonian military leaders were engaged in a struggle for power, and by 301 BCE, all hope of unity was dead. Hellenistic monarchies. Eventually, 4 Hellenistic kingdoms emerged as the successors to Alexander. In Macedonia, the struggle for power led to the extermination of Alexander the Great's dynasty. Not until 276 BCE did Antigonus Gonatas, the grandson of one of Alexander's generals, succeed in establishing the Antigonid dynasty as rulers of Macedonia and Greece. Another Hellenistic kingdom emerged in Egypt, where a Macedonian general named Ptolemy established himself as king in 305 BCE, initiating the Ptolemaic dynasty of pharaohs. A third Hellenistic kingdom came into being in 230 BCE when Attalus I declared himself king of Pergamum in Asia Minor and established the Attalid dynasty. The Seleucid kingdom and India. By far the largest of the Hellenistic kingdoms was founded by the general Seleucus, who established the Seleucid dynasty of Syria, which controlled much of the old Persian Empire from Turkey in the west to India in the east. The Seleucids, however, found it increasingly difficult to maintain control of the eastern territories. In fact, the Indian ruler Chandragupta Maurya created a new Indian state, the Mauryan Empire, in 324 BCE and drove out the Seleucid forces. His grandson Ashoka extended the empire to include most of India. A pious Buddhist, Ashoka sought to convert the remaining Greek communities in northwestern India to his religion. The Seleucid rulers maintained relations with the Mauryan Empire. trade was fostered, especially in such luxuries as spices and jewels. Seleucus also sent Greek and Macedonian ambassadors to the Mauryan court. Best known of these was Megasthenes, whose report on the people of India remained one of the West's best sources of information until the Middle Ages. Political institutions. The Hellenistic monarchies created a semblance of stability for several centuries, even though Hellenistic kings refused to accept the status quo and periodically engaged in wars to alter it. At the same time, an underlying strain always existed between the new Greco-Macedonian ruling class and the native populations. Together these factors created a certain degree of tension that was never truly ended until the Roman state to the west stepped in and imposed a new order. Although Alexander the Great had apparently planned to fuse Greeks and Easterners, he used Persians as administrators, encouraged his soldiers to marry Easterners, and did so himself. Hellenistic monarchs who succeeded him relied primarily on Greeks and Macedonians to form the new ruling class. Even those Easterners who did advance to important administrative posts had learned Greek. All government business was transacted in Greek, and had become Hellenized in a cultural sense. The Greek ruling class was determined to maintain its privileged position. Hellenistic cities. Cities played an especially important role in the Hellenistic kingdoms. Throughout his conquests, Alexander had founded new cities and military settlements, and Hellenistic kings did likewise. The new population centers varied considerably in size and importance. Military settlements were meant to maintain order and might consist of only a few hundred men strongly dependent on the king. But there were also new independent cities with thousands of inhabitants. Alexandria in Egypt was the largest city in the Mediterranean region by the 1st century BCE. Seleucus was especially active in founding new cities. According to one ancient writer, the other kings have exulted in destroying existing cities. He, on the other hand, arranged to build cities which did not yet exist. He established so many that they were enough to carry the names of towns in Macedonia as well as the names of those in his family. One can go to Phoenicia to see his cities, one can go to Syria and see even more. Hellenistic rulers encouraged a massive spread of Greek colonists to the Middle East because of their intrinsic value to the new monarchies. Greeks and Macedonians provided not only recruits for the army but also a pool of civilian administrators and workers who contributed to economic development. Even architects, engineers, dramatists, and actors were in demand in the new Greek cities. Many Greeks and Macedonians were quick to see the advantages of moving to the new urban centers and gladly sought their fortunes in the Middle East. The Greek cities of the Hellenistic era were the chief agents in the spread of Greek culture in the Middle East as far, in fact, as modern Afghanistan and India. The Greeks' belief in their own cultural superiority provided an easy rationalization for their political dominance of the eastern cities. But Greek control of the new cities was also necessary because the kings frequently used the cities as instruments of government, enabling them to rule considerable territory without an extensive bureaucracy. At the same time, for security reasons, the Greeks needed the support of the kings. After all, the Hellenistic cities were islands of Greek culture in a sea of non-Greeks. The importance of trade. Agriculture was still of primary importance to both the native populations and the new Greek cities of the Hellenistic world. The Greek cities continued their old agrarian patterns. A well-defined citizen body owned land and worked it with the assistance of slaves. But these farms were isolated units in a vast area of land ultimately owned by the king or assigned to larger estate owners and worked by native peasants dwelling in villages. Commerce expanded considerably in the Hellenistic era. Indeed, trading contacts linked much of the Hellenistic world. The decline in the number of political barriers encouraged more commercial traffic. Although Hellenistic monarchs still fought wars, the conquests of Alexander and the policies of his successors made possible greater trade between East and West. Two major trade routes connected the east with the Mediterranean. The major route proceeded by sea from India to the Persian Gulf and then up the Tigris River to Seleucia on the Tigris. Overland routes from Seleucia then led to Antioch and Ephesus. A southern route also began by sea from India but went around Arabia and up the Red Sea to Petra and later Berenice. Caravan routes then led overland to Coptos on the Nile, thence to Alexandria and the Mediterranean. An incredible variety of products were traded: gold and silver from Spain, salt from Asia Minor, timber from Macedonia, ebony, gems, ivory, and spices from India, frankincense, used on altars, from Arabia, slaves from Thrace, Syria, and Asia Minor, fine wines from Syria and Western Asia Minor, olive oil from Athens, and numerous exquisite foodstuffs, such as the famous prunes of Damascus. The greatest trade, however, was in the basic staple of life, grain. Social life, new opportunities for women. The development of the kingdom as the focus of political life in the Hellenistic era resulted in fewer restrictions on the role women. In many cities, for example, women of all classes had a new freedom of movement. However, the most notable gains, especially for upper-class women, came in the economic realm. Documents show increasing numbers of women involved in managing slaves, selling property, and making loans. Even then, legal contracts made by women had to include their official male guardians. Only in Sparta were women free to control their own economic affairs. Many Spartan women were noticeably wealthy. Females owned 40% of Spartan land. Spartan women, however, were an exception, especially on the Greek mainland. Women in Athens, for example, still remained highly restricted and supervised. Although a few philosophers welcomed female participation in men's affairs, many philosophers rejected equality between men and women and asserted that the traditional roles of wives and mothers were most satisfying for women. And although they were now less restricted, peasant women experienced no real benefit from this freedom because they were still subject to a lifetime of hard work. The large group of women who were condemned to the practice of prostitution faced an even harsher reality. But the opinions of philosophers did not prevent upper-class women from making gains in areas other than the economic sphere. New possibilities for females arose when women in some areas of the Hellenistic world were allowed to pursue education in the traditional fields of literature, music, and even athletics. Education, then, provided no opportunities for women. Female poets appeared in the 3rd century BCE, and there are instances of women involved in both scholarly and artistic activities. The creation of the Hellenistic monarchies, which represented a considerable departure from the world of the city-state, also gave new scope to the role played by the monarch's wives, the Hellenistic queens. In Macedonia, a pattern of alliances between mothers and sons provided openings for women to take an active role in politics, especially in political intrigue. In Egypt, opportunities for royal women were even greater because the Ptolemaic rulers reverted to an Egyptian custom of kings marrying their own sisters. Of the first 8 Ptolemaic rulers, 4 wed their sisters. Ptolemy II and his sister wife Arsinoe II were both worshipped as gods in their lifetimes. Arsinoe played an energetic role in government and was involved in the expansion of the Egyptian navy. She was also the first Egyptian queen whose portrait appeared on coins with that of her husband. Culture in the Hellenistic world. Although the Hellenistic kingdoms encompassed vast territories and many diverse peoples, the diffusion of Greek culture throughout the Hellenistic world provided a sense of unity. The Hellenistic era was a period of considerable accomplishment in many areas: literature, art, science, and philosophy. Although these achievements occurred throughout the Hellenistic world, certain centers, especially the great cities of Alexandria and Pergamum, stood out. In both cities, cultural developments were encouraged by the rulers themselves. Rich Hellenistic monarchs had considerable resources with which to patronize culture. New directions in literature and as art. The Hellenistic age produced an enormous quantity of literature, most of which has not survived. Hellenistic monarchs, who held literary talent in high esteem, subsidized writers on a grand scale. The Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt were particularly lavish. The combination of their largesse and a famous library with more than 500,000 scrolls drew a host of scholars and authors to Alexandria, including a circle of poets. Theocritus, c. 315 to 250 BCE, originally a native of the island of Sicily, wrote little poems known as idylls dealing with erotic subjects, lovers' complaints, and pastoral themes expressing love of nature and appreciation of nature's beauties. In the Hellenistic era, Athens remained the theatrical center of the Greek world. Tragedy had fallen by the wayside, but a new style of comedy came to the fore. New comedy completely rejected political themes and sought only to entertain and amuse. The Athenian playwright Menander, c. 342 to 291 BCE, was perhaps the best representative of new comedy. Plots were simple. Typically, a hero falls in love with a not really so bad prostitute, who turns out eventually to be the long-lost daughter of a rich neighbor. The hero marries her, and they live happily ever after. In addition to being patrons of literary talent, the Hellenistic monarchs were eager to spend their money to beautify and adorn the cities within their states. The founding of new cities and the rebuilding of old ones provided numerous opportunities for Greek architects and sculptors. The buildings of the Greek homeland, gymnasia, baths, theaters, and, of course, temples line the streets of these cities. Both Hellenistic monarchs and rich citizens patronized sculptors. Thousands of statues, many paid for by the people honored, were erected in towns and cities all over the Hellenistic world. Sculptors traveled throughout this world, attracted by the material rewards offered by wealthy patrons. As a result, Hellenistic sculpture was characterized by a considerable degree of uniformity. Hellenistic artistic styles even affected artists in India. While maintaining the technical skill of the classical period, Hellenistic sculptors moved away from the idealism of 5th century classicism to a more emotional and realistic art, seen in numerous statues of old women, drunkards, and little children at play. A golden age of science. The Hellenistic era witnessed a more conscious separation of science from philosophy. In classical Greece, what we would call the physical and life sciences had been divisions of philosophical inquiry. Nevertheless, by the time of Aristotle, the Greeks had already established an important principle of scientific investigation, empirical research, or systematic observation as the basis for generalization. In the Hellenistic age, the sciences tended to be studied in their own right. One of the traditional areas of Greek science was astronomy, and two Alexandrian scholars continued this exploration. Aristarchus of Samos, c. 310 to 230 BCE, developed a heliocentric view of the universe, contending that the sun and the fixed stars remain stationary while the earth rotates around the sun in a circular orbit. He also argued that the earth rotates around its own axis. This view was not widely accepted, and most scholars clung to the earlier geocentric view of the Greeks, which held that the earth was at the center of the universe. Another astronomer, Eratosthenes, c. 275 to 194 BCE, determined that the earth was round and calculated its circumference at 24,675 miles within 200 miles of the actual figure. A third Alexandrian scholar was Euclid, who lived around 300 BCE. He established a school in Alexandria but is primarily known for his work titled Elements. This was a systematic organization of the fundamental elements of geometry as they had already been worked out. It became the standard textbook of plane geometry and was used up to modern times. By far the most famous scientist of the period was Archimedes, 287 to 212 BCE, of Syracuse. Archimedes was especially important for his work on the geometry of spheres and cylinders and for establishing the value of the mathematical constant pi. Archimedes was also a practical inventor. He may have devised the so-called Archimedean screw, used to pump water out of mines and to lift irrigation water. During the Roman siege of Syracuse, he constructed a number of devices to thwart the attackers. According to Plutarch's account, the Romans became so frightened that if they did but see a little rope or a piece of wood from the wall, instantly crying out, that there it was again, Archimedes was about to let fly some engine at them, they turned their backs and fled. Archimedes' accomplishments inspired a wealth of semi-legendary stories. Supposedly, he discovered specific gravity by observing the water he displaced in his bath and became so excited by his realization that he jumped out of the water and ran home naked, shouting, "Eureka! I have found it." He is said to have emphasized the importance of levers by proclaiming to the king of Syracuse, "Give me a lever and a place to stand, and I will move the earth." The king was so impressed that he encouraged Archimedes to lower his sights and build defensive weapons instead. Philosophy, new schools of thought. While Alexandria and Pergamum became the renowned cultural centers of the Hellenistic world, Athens remained the prime center for philosophy. After Alexander the Great, the home of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle continued to attract the most illustrious philosophers from the Greek world, who chose to establish their schools there. New schools of philosophical thought reinforced Athens's reputation as a philosophical center. Epicurus, 341 to 270 BCE, the founder of Epicureanism, established a school in Athens near the end of the 4th century BCE. Epicurus believed that human beings were free to follow self-interest as a basic motivating force. Happiness was the goal of life, and the means to achieve it was the pursuit of pleasure, the only true good. But the pursuit of pleasure was not meant in a physical, hedonistic sense, as our word Epicurean has come to mean. Pleasure was not satisfying one's desire in an active, gluttonous fashion but rather freedom from emotional turmoil, freedom from worry, the freedom that came from a mind at rest. To achieve this kind of pleasure, one had to free oneself from public affairs and politics. But this was not a renunciation of all social life, for to Epicurus, a life could be complete only when it was based on friendship. His own life in Athens was an embodiment of his teachings. Epicurus and his friends created their own private community where they could pursue their ideal of true happiness. Another school of thought was Stoicism, which became the most popular philosophy of the Hellenistic world and later flourished in the Roman Empire as well. It was the product of a teacher named Zeno, 335 to 263 BCE, who came to Athens and began to teach in a public colonnade known as the Painted Portico, the stopoikal, hence the name Stoicism. Like Epicureanism, Stoicism was concerned with how individuals find happiness. But Stoics took a radically different approach to the problem. To them, happiness, the supreme good, could be found only by living in harmony with the divine will, by which people gained inner peace. Life's problems could not disturb these people, and they could bear whatever life offered, hence our word Stoic. Unlike Epicureans, Stoics did not believe in the need to separate oneself from the world and politics. Public service was regarded as noble, and the real Stoic was a good citizen and could even be a good government official. Both Epicureanism and Stoicism focused primarily on human happiness, and their popularity would suggest a fundamental change in the Greek lifestyle. In the classical Greek world, the happiness of individuals and the meaning of life were closely associated with the life of the polis. One found fulfillment in the community. In the Hellenistic kingdoms, the sense that one could find satisfaction and fulfillment through life in the polis had weakened. People sought new philosophies that offered personal happiness, and in the cosmopolitan world of the Hellenistic states, with their mixture of peoples, a new openness to thoughts of universality could also emerge. For some people, Stoicism embodied this larger sense of community. The appeal of new philosophies in the Hellenistic era can also be explained by the apparent decline in certain aspects of traditional religion. Religion in the Hellenistic world. When the Greeks spread throughout the Hellenistic kingdoms, they took their gods with them. But over a period of time, there was a noticeable decline in the vitality of the traditional Greek religion, which left Greeks receptive to the numerous religious cults of the Eastern world. The Eastern religions that appealed most to Greeks, however, were the mystery religions. What was the source of their attraction? Mystery cults, with their secret initiations and promises of individual salvation, were not new to the Greek world. But the Greeks of the Hellenistic era were also strongly influenced by Eastern mystery cults, such as those of Egypt, which offered a distinct advantage over the Greek mystery religions. The latter had usually been connected to specific locations, such as Eleusis, which meant that a would-be initiate had to undertake a pilgrimage in order to participate in the rites. In contrast, the Eastern mystery religions were readily available since temples to their gods and goddesses were located throughout the Greek cities of the East. All of the mystery religions were based on the same fundamental premises. Individuals could pursue a path to salvation and achieve eternal life by being initiated into a union with a savior god or goddess who had died and risen again. The Egyptian cult of Isis was one of the most popular mystery religions. Isis was the goddess of women, marriage, and children. As one of her hymns states, "I am she whom women call goddess. I ordain that women should be loved by men, I brought wife and husband together, and invented the marriage contract. I ordain that women should bear children." Isis was also portrayed as the giver of civilization, who had brought laws and letters to all humankind. The cult of Isis offered a precious commodity to its initiates, the promise of eternal life. In many ways, the cult of Isis and the other mystery religions of the Hellenistic era helped pave the way for Christianity. Chronology. The Persian Wars. Rebellion of Greek cities in Asia Minor. 499 to 494 BCE Battle of Marathon. 490 BCE Xerxes invades Greece. 480 to 479 BCE Battles of Thermopylae and Salamis. 480 BCE Battle of Plataea. 479 BCE Chronology. The rise of Macedonia and the conquests of Alexander. Reign of Philip. 359 to 336 BCE Battle of Chaeronea. Philip II conquers Greece. 338 BCE Reign of Alexander the Great. 336 to 323 BCE Alexander invades Asia. Battle of Granicus River. 334 BCE Battle of Issus. 333 BCE Battle of Gaugamela. 331 BCE Fall of Persepolis, the Persian capital. 330 BCE Alexander enters India. 327 BCE Battle of Hydaspes River. 326 BCE Death of Alexander. 323 BCE Homer's ideal of excellence. Family and society. The Iliad and the Odyssey, which the Greeks believed were written by Homer, were used as basic texts for the education of Greeks for hundreds of years during antiquity. This passage from the Iliad, describing a conversation between Hector, prince of Troy, and his wife, Andromache, illustrates the Greek ideal of gaining honor through combat. At the end of the passage, Homer also reveals what became the Greek attitude toward women. They are supposed to spin and weave and take care of their households and children. Homer, Iliad. Hector looked at his son and smiled, but said nothing. Andromache, bursting into tears, went up to him and put her hand in his. "Hector," she said, "you are possessed. This bravery of yours will be your end. You do not think of your little boy or your unhappy wife, whom you will make a widow soon. Someday the Achaeans, Greeks, are bound to kill you in a massed attack. And when I lose you I might as well be dead. I have no father, no mother, Now, I had 7 brothers too at home. In one day all of them went down to Hades' house. The great Achilles of the swift feet killed them all. So you, Hector, are father and mother and brother to me, as well as my beloved husband. Have pity on me now, stay here on the tower, and do not make your boy an orphan and your wife a widow. All that, my dear, said the great Hector of the glittering helmet, is surely my concern. But if I hid myself like a coward and refused to fight, I could never face the Trojans. Besides, it would go against the grain, for I have trained myself always, like a good soldier, to take my place in the front line and win glory for my father and myself. As he finished, glorious Hector held out his arms to take his boy. But the child shrank back with a cry to the bosom of his girdled nurse, alarmed by his father's appearance. He was frightened by the bronze of the helmet and the horsehair plume that he saw nodding grimly down at him. His father and his lardy mother had to laugh. But noble Hector quickly took his helmet off and put the dazzling thing on the ground. Then he kissed his son, and prayed to Zeus and the other gods. Zeus, and you other gods, grant that this boy of mine may be, like me, preeminent in Troy, as strong and brave as I, a mighty king of Ilium. May people say, when he comes back from battle, here is a better man than his father. Let him bring home the blood-stained armor of the enemy he has killed, and make his mother happy. Hector handed the boy to his wife. She was smiling through her tears, and when her husband saw this he was moved. He stroked her with his hand and said, "My dear, I beg you not to be too much distressed. No one is going to send me down to Hades before my proper time. But fate is a thing that no man born of woman, coward, or hero can escape. Go home now, and attend to your own work, the loom and the spindle, and see that the maidservants get on with theirs. War is men's business, and this war is the business of every man in Ilium, myself above all." What important ideals for Greek men and women are revealed in this passage from the Iliad? How do the women's ideals compare with those for ancient Indian and Chinese women? The Lycurgan reforms. Family and society. To maintain their control over the helots, the Spartans instituted the reforms that created their military state. In this account of the lawgiver Lycurgus, the Greek historian Plutarch discusses the effect of these reforms on the treatment and education of boys. Plutarch, Lycurgus. Lycurgus was of another mind. He would not have masters bought out of the market for his young Spartans. Nor was it lawful, indeed, for the father himself to breed up the children after his own fancy, but as soon as they were 7 years old they were to be enrolled in certain companies and classes, where they all lived under the same order and discipline, doing their exercises and taking their play together. Of these, he who showed the most conduct and courage was made captain. They had their eyes always upon him, obeyed his orders, and underwent patiently whatsoever punishment he inflicted, so that the whole course of their education was one continued exercise of a ready and perfect obedience. The old men, too, were spectators of their performances, and often raised quarrels and disputes among them, to have a good opportunity of finding out their different characters, and of seeing which would be valiant, which a coward, when they should come to more dangerous encounters. Reading and writing they gave them, just enough to serve their turn. Their chief care was to make them good subjects, and to teach them to endure pain and conquer in battle. To this end, as they grew in years, their discipline was proportionately increased, their heads were close clipped, they were accustomed to go barefoot, and for the most part to play naked. After they were 12 years old, they were no longer allowed to wear any undergarments. They had one coat to serve them a year. Their bodies were hard and dry, with but little acquaintance of baths and unguents. These human indulgences they were allowed only on some few particular days in the year. They lodged together in little bands upon beds made of the rushes which grew by the banks of the river Eurotas, which they were to break off with their hands with a knife, if it were winter. They mingled some thistledown with their rushes, which it was thought had the property of giving warmth. By the time they were come to the sage, there was not any of the more hopeful boys who had not a lover to bear him company. The old men, too, had an eye upon them, coming often to the grounds to hear and see them contend either in wit or strength with one another, and this as seriously as if they were their fathers, their tutors, or their magistrates, so that there scarcely was any time or place without someone present to put them in mind of their duty, and punish them if they had neglected it. Spartan boys were also encouraged to steal their food. They stole, too, all other meat they could lay their hands on, looking out and watching all opportunities, when people were asleep or more careless than usual. If they were caught, they were not only punished with whipping, but hunger, too, being reduced to their ordinary allowance, which was but very slender, and so contrived on purpose, that they might set about to help themselves, and be forced to exercise their energy and address. This was the principal design of their hard fare. What does this passage from Plutarch's account of Lycurgus reveal about the nature of the Spartan state? Why would the entire program have been distasteful to the Athenians? Athenian democracy, the funeral oration of Pericles. Politics and government. In his history of the Peloponnesian War, the Greek historian Thucydides presented his reconstruction of the eulogy given by Pericles in the winter of 431 to 430 BCE to honor the Athenians killed in the first campaigns of the Great Peloponnesian War. It is a magnificent, idealized description of Athenian democracy at its height. Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War. Our constitution is called a democracy because power is in the hands not of a minority but of the whole people. When it is a question of settling private disputes, everyone is equal before the law. When it is a question of putting one person before another in positions of public responsibility, what counts is not membership of a particular class, but the actual ability which the man possesses. No one, so long as he has it in him to be of service to the state, is kept in political obscurity because of poverty. And, just as our political life is free and open, so is our day-to-day life in our relations with each other. We do not get into a state with our next-door neighbor if he enjoys himself in his own way, nor do we give him the kind of black looks which, though they do no real harm, still do hurt people's feelings. We are free and tolerant in our private lives, but in public affairs we keep to the law. This is because it commands our deep respect. We give our obedience to those whom we put in positions of authority, and we obey the laws themselves, especially those which are for the protection of the oppressed, and those unwritten laws which it is an acknowledged shame to break. Here each individual is interested not only in his own affairs but in the affairs of the state as well. Even those who are mostly occupied with their own business are extremely well informed on general politics. This is a peculiarity of ours. We do not say that a man who takes no interest in politics is a man who minds his own business. We say that he has no business here at all. We Athenians, in our own persons, take our decisions on policy or submit them to proper discussions, for we do not think that there is an incompatibility between words and deeds. The worst thing is to rush into action before the consequences have been properly debated. Taking everything together then, I declare that our city is an education to Greece, and I declare that in my opinion each single one of our citizens, in all the manifold aspects of life, is able to show himself the rightful lord and owner of his own person, and do this, moreover, with exceptional grace and exceptional versatility. And to show that this is no empty boasting for the present occasion, but real tangible fact, you have only to consider the power which our city possesses and which has been won by those very qualities which I have mentioned. In the eyes of Pericles, what are the ideals of Athenian democracy? In what ways does Pericles exaggerate his claims? Why would the Athenian passion for debate described by Pericles have been distasteful to the Spartans? On the other hand, how does eagerness for discussion perfectly suit democracy? Sophocles, The Miracle of Man. Religion and Philosophy in Antigone. Sophocles presents a thoughtful analysis of the painful dilemmas in human existence. In one outstanding passage, the chorus expresses an exalted message on human resourcefulness and the achievements of human beings. Sophocles, Antigone. Is there anything more wonderful on earth, our marvelous planet, than the miracle of man? With what arrogant ease he rides the dangerous seas, from the waves' towering summit to the yawning trough beneath. The Earth Mother herself, before time began, the oldest of the ageless gods, learned to endure his driving plough, turning the earth and breaking the clods till by the sweat of his brow she yielded up her fruitfulness. He has mastered the mysteries of language, and thought, which moves faster than the wind, he has tamed, and made rational. Political wisdom too, all the knowledge of people and states, all the practical arts of government he has studied and refined, built cities to shelter his head against rain and anger and cold, and ordered all things in his mind. There is no problem he cannot resolve by the exercise of his brains or his breath, and the only disease he cannot salve or cure, is death. In action he is subtle beyond imagination, limitless is his skill, and these gifts are both enemies and friends, as he applies them, with equal determination, to good or evil ends. All men honor, and the state uplifts that man to the heights of glory, whose powers uphold the constitution, and the gods, and their laws. His city prospers. But if he shifts his ground, and takes the wrong path, despising morality, and blown up with pride, indulges himself and his power, at my hearth may he never warm himself, or sit at my side. What is Sophocles' view of humans and their accomplishments? What are the limitations to these human accomplishments? Comparative essay. The Axial Age. Art and Ideas. By the 4th century BCE, important regional civilizations existed in China, India, Southwest Asia, and the Mediterranean. During their formative periods between 700 and 300 BCE, all were characterized by the emergence of religious and philosophical thinkers who established ideas or axes that remain the basis for religions and philosophical thought in those societies for hundreds of years. Hence, some historians have referred to the period when these ideas developed as the Axial Age. During the 5th and 4th centuries in Greece, the philosophers Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle not only proposed philosophical and political ideas crucial to the Greek world and later to Roman and Western civilization, but also conceived of a rational method of inquiry that became important to modern science. By the 7th century BCE, concepts of monotheism had developed in Persia through the teachings of Zoroaster and in Canaan through the Hebrew prophets. In Judaism, the Hebrews developed a world religion that influenced the later religions of Christianity and Islam. During the 6th century, two major schools of thought, Confucianism and Taoism, emerged in China. Both sought to spell out the principles that would create a stable order in society. And although their views of reality were diametrically opposed, both came to have an impact on Chinese civilization that lasted into the 20th century. Two of the world's greatest religions, Hinduism and Buddhism, began in India during the Axial Age. Hinduism was an outgrowth of the religious beliefs of the Aryan peoples who settled in India. These ideas were expressed in the sacred texts known as the Vedas and in the Upanishads, which were commentaries on the Vedas compiled in the 6th century BCE. With its belief in reincarnation, Hinduism provided justification for India's rigid class system. Buddhism was the product of one man, Siddhartha Gautama, known as the Buddha, who lived in the 6th century BCE. The Buddha's simple message of achieving wisdom created a new spiritual philosophy that would rival Hinduism. Although a product of India, Buddhism also spread to other parts of the world. Although these philosophies and religions developed in different areas of the world, they had some features in common. Like the Chinese philosophers Confucius and Lao Tzu, the Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle had different ideas about the nature of reality. Thinkers in India and China also developed rational methods of inquiry similar to those of Plato and Aristotle. And regardless of their origins, when we speak of Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, or Greek philosophical thought, we realize that the ideas of the axial age not only spread around the world at different times but are also still an integral part of our world today. What do historians mean when they speak of the axial age? What do you think could explain the emergence of similar ideas in different parts of the world during this period? Opposing viewpoints? Women in Athens and Sparta. Family and society. In classical Athens, a woman's place was in the home. She had two major responsibilities as a wife, bearing and raising children and managing the household. In the first selection, from a dialogue on estate management, Xenophon relates the instructions of an Athenian to his new wife. Although women in Sparta had the same responsibilities as women in Athens, they assumed somewhat different roles as a result of the Spartan lifestyle. The second, third, and fourth selections demonstrate these differences as seen in the accounts of three ancient Greek writers. Xenophon, Economicus. Ischomachus addresses his new wife, "For it seems to me, dear, that the gods with great discernment have coupled together male and female, as they are called, chiefly in order that they may form a perfect partnership in mutual service. For, in the first place, that the various species of living creatures may not fail, they are joined in wedlock for the production of children. Secondly, offspring to support them in old age is provided by this union, to human beings, at any rate. Thirdly, human beings live not in the open air, like beasts, but obviously need shelter. Nevertheless, those who mean to win stores to fill the covered place, have need of someone to work at the open-air occupations, since plowing, sowing, planting and grazing are all such open-air employments, and these supply the needful food. For he made the man's body and mind more capable of enduring cold and heat, and journeys and campaigns, and therefore, imposed on him the outdoor tasks. To the woman, since he had made her body less capable of such endurance, I take it that God has assigned the indoor tasks. And knowing that he had created in the woman and had imposed on her the nourishment of the infants, he meted out to her a larger portion of affection for newborn babes than to the man. Your duty will be to remain indoors and send out those servants whose work is outside, and superintend those who are to work indoors, and to receive the incomings, and distribute so much of them as must be spent, and watch over so much as is to be kept in store, and take care that the sum laid by for a year be not spent in a month. And when wool is brought to you, you must see that cloaks are made for those that want them. You must see too that the dry corn is in good condition for making food. One of the duties that fall to you, however, will perhaps seem rather thankless. You will have to see that any servant who is ill is cared for." Xenophon, Constitution of the Spartans. First, to begin at the beginning, I will start with the begetting of children. Elsewhere, those girls who are going to have children and are considered to have been well brought up are nourished with the plainest diet which is practicable and the smallest amount of luxury good possible. Wine is certainly not allowed them at all, or only if well diluted. Just as the majority of craftsmen are sedentary, the other Greeks expect their girls to sit quietly and work wool. But how can one expect girls brought up like this to give birth to healthy babies? Lycurgus considered slave girls quite adequate to produce clothing, and thought that for free women the most important job was to bear children. In the first place, therefore, he prescribed physical training for the female sex no less than for the male, and next, just as for men, he arranged competitions of racing and strength for women also, thinking that if both parents were strong their children would be more robust. Aristotle, Politics. Now, this license of the Spartan women, from the earliest times, was to be expected. For the men were absent from home for long periods of time on military expeditions, fighting the war against the Argives and again against the Arcadians and Messenians. And nearly 2/5 of the whole country is in the hands of women, both because there have been numerous heiresses, and because large dowries are customary. And yet it would have been better to have regulated them, and given none at all or small or even moderate ones. But at present it is possible for a man to give an inheritance to whomever he chooses. Plutarch, Lycurgus. Since Lycurgus regarded education as the most important and finest duty of the legislator, he began at the earliest stage by looking at matters relating to marriages and births. For he exercised the girls' bodies with races and wrestling and discus and javelin throwing, so that the embryos formed in them would have a strong start in strong bodies and develop better, and they would undergo their pregnancies with vigor and would cope well and easily with childbirth. He got rid of daintiness and sheltered upbringing and effeminacy of all kinds, by accustoming the girls no less than the young men to walking naked in processions and dancing and singing at certain festivals, when young men were present and watching. The nudity of the girls had nothing disgraceful in it, for modesty was present and immorality absent, but rather it made them accustomed to simplicity and enthusiastic as to physical fitness, and gave the female sex a taste of noble spirit, inasmuch as they too had a share in valor and ambition. In what ways were the lifestyles of Athenian and Spartan women the same? In what ways were they different? How did the Athenian and Spartan views of the world shape their conceptions of gender and gender roles, and why were those conceptions different? Alexander meets an Indian king. Politics and government. In his campaigns in India, Alexander fought a number of difficult battles. At the Battle of the Hydaspes River, he faced a strong opponent in the Indian king Porus. After defeating Porus, Alexander treated him with respect, according to Arrian, Alexander's ancient biographer. Arrian, The Campaigns of Alexander. Throughout the action Porus had proved himself a man indeed, not only as a commander but as a soldier of the truest courage. When he saw his cavalry cut to pieces, most of his infantry dead, and his elephants killed or roaming riderless and bewildered about the field, his behavior was very different from that of the Persian king Darius. Unlike Darius, he did not lead the scramble to save his own skin, but so long as a single unit of his men held together, fought bravely on. It was only when he was himself wounded that he turned the elephant on which he rode and began to withdraw. Alexander, anxious to save the life of this great soldier, sent to him an Indian named Morose, a man he had been told had long been Porus's friend. Porus listened to Morose's message, stopped his elephant, and dismounted. He was much distressed by thirst, so when he had revived himself by drinking, he told Morose to conduct him with all speed to Alexander. Alexander, informed of his approach, rode out to meet him. When they met, he reined in his horse, and looked at his adversary with admiration. He was a magnificent figure of a man, over 7 feet high and of great personal beauty. His bearing had lost none of its pride. His air was of one brave man meeting another, of a king in the presence of a king, with whom he had fought honorably for his kingdom. Alexander was the first to speak. "What," he said, "do you wish that I should do with you?" "Treat me as a king ought," Porus is said to have replied. "For my part," said Alexander, pleased by his answer, "your request shall be granted. But is there not something you would wish for yourself? Ask it." "Everything," said Porus, "is contained in this one request." The dignity of these words gave Alexander even more pleasure, and he restored to Porus his sovereignty over his subjects, adding to his realm other territory of even greater extent. Thus, he did indeed use a brave man as a king ought, and from that time forward found him in every way a loyal friend. What do we learn from Arrian's account about Alexander's military skills and Indian methods of fighting? Relations between Greeks and non-Greeks. Politics and government. The relationship between the Greek conquerors and the native peoples of the Near East was often a difficult one. Although a number of native people learned Greek to advance their economic and political careers, they were often not treated as equals by the dominant Greek minority. The following documents reveal two facets of the problem. The first one is by a native complaining about his treatment by the Greeks. The second document reveals the dangers Greeks sometimes experienced from local peoples. Letter to Zenon. To Zenon, greeting. You do well if you are healthy. I too am well. You know that you left me in Syria with Crotos, and I did everything that was ordered with respect to the camels and was blameless towards you. When you sent to order to give me pay, he gave nothing of what you ordered. When I asked repeatedly that he give me what you ordered, and Crotos gave me nothing, but kept telling me to remove myself. So I wrote to you that you might know that Crotos was the cause of it. When you sent me again to Philadelphia to Jason, although I do everything that is ordered, for 9 months now he gives me nothing of what you ordered me to have, neither oil nor grain. And I am toiling away both summer and winter. And he orders me to accept sour wine for my ration. Well, they have treated me with scorn because I am a barbarian. I beg you therefore, if it seems good to you, to give them orders that I am to obtain what is owing, and that in future they pay me in full, in order that I may not perish of hunger because I do not know how to speak Greek. Letter to Dionysios. To Dionysios from Ptolemaios. Being outrageously wronged and often put in danger of my life by the below-listed cleaners from the sanctuary, I am seeking refuge with you, thinking that I shall thus particularly receive justice. For in the 21st year, they came to the sanctuary, in which I have been for the aforesaid years, some of them holding stones in their hands, others sticks, and tried to force their way in, so that with this opportunity they might plunder the temple and kill me because I am a Greek, attacking me in concerted fashion. And when I made it to the door of the temple before them and shut it with a great crash, and ordered them to go away quietly, they did not depart, but they struck Diphilos, one of the servants, who showed his indignation at the way they were behaving in the sanctuary, robbing him outrageously and attacking him violently and beating him, so that their illegal violence was made obvious to everybody. What do these documents reveal about the problems that arise in the relationship between conquerors and the conquered? Film and History. Alexander, 2004. Alexander is a product of director Oliver Stone's lifelong fascination with Alexander, the king of Macedonia, who conquered the Persian Empire in the 4th century BCE and launched the Hellenistic era. Stone's epic film cost $150 million, which resulted in an elaborate and in places visually beautiful film. Narrated by the aging Ptolemy, Anthony Hopkins, Alexander's Macedonian general who took control of Egypt after his death, the film tells the story of Alexander, Colin Farrell, through an intermix of battle scenes showing the progress of Alexander and his army through the Middle East and India, and flashbacks to his early years. Stone portrays Alexander's relationship with his mother, Olympias, Angelina Jolie, as instrumental in his early development, while also focusing on his rocky relationship with his father, King Philip II, Val Kilmer. The movie elaborates on the major battle at Gaugamela in 331 BCE, where the Persian leader Darius is forced to flee, and then follows Alexander as he conquers the rest of the Persian Empire and continues east into India. After his troops begin to mutiny, Alexander returns to Babylon, where he dies on June 10, 323 BCE. The enormous amount of money spent on the film enabled Stone to achieve a stunning visual spectacle, but as history, the film leaves much to be desired. The character of Alexander is never developed in depth. He is shown at times as a weak character who is plagued by doubts over his decisions and often seems obsessed with his desire for glory. Alexander is also portrayed as an idealistic leader who believed that the people he conquered wanted change, that he was freeing the people of the world, and that Asia and Europe would grow together into a single entity. But was Alexander an idealistic dreamer, as Stone apparently believes, Or was he a military leader who, following the dictum that fortune favors the bold, ran roughshod over the wishes of his soldiers in order to follow his dream and was responsible for mass slaughter in the process? The latter is a perspective that Stone glosses over, but Ptolemy probably expresses the more realistic notion that none of us believed in his dream. The movie also does not elaborate on Alexander's wish to be a god. Certainly, Alexander aspired to divine honors. At one point he sent instructions to the Greek cities to vote him a god. Stone's portrayal of Alexander is perhaps most realistic in presenting his drinking binges and his bisexuality, which was common in the Greco-Roman world. The movie shows not only his marriage to Roxanne, Rosario Dawson, daughter of a Bactrian noble, but also his love for his lifelong companion, Hephaestion, Jared Leto, and his sexual relationship with the Persian male slave Bagoas, Francisco Bosch. The film contains a number of inaccurate historical details. Alexander's first encounters with the Persian royal princesses and Bagoas did not occur when he entered Babylon for the first time. Alexander did not kill Clitus in India, and he was not wounded in India at the Battle of the Hydaspes River but at the Siege of Mali. Specialists in Persian history have also argued that the Persian military forces were much more disciplined than they are depicted in the film. Comparative illustration. Art and ideas. Hellenistic sculpture and a Greek-style Buddha. Greek architects and sculptors were highly valued throughout the Hellenistic world. Shown on the left is a terracotta statuette of a draped young woman, made as a tomb offering near Thebes, probably around 300 BCE. The incursion of Alexander into Western India resulted in some Greek cultural influences there, especially during the Hellenistic era. During the 1st century BCE, Indian sculptors in Gandhara, which today is part of Pakistan, began to make statues of the Buddha in a style that combined Indian and Hellenistic artistic traditions, as in the stone sculpture of the Buddha on the right. Note the wavy hair topped by a bun tied with a ribbon, also a feature of earlier statues of Greek deities. This Buddha is also seen wearing a Greek-style toga. How do you explain the influence of Hellenistic styles in India? What can you conclude from this example about the influence of conquerors on conquered people? Chapter Summary. Unlike the great centralized empires of the Persians and the Chinese, ancient Greece consisted of a large number of small, independent city-states, of which the most famous was Sparta, a militaristic polis ruled by an oligarchy, and Athens, which became known for its democratic institutions despite the fact that many slaves and women had no political rights. Despite the small size of their city-states, these ancient Greeks created a civilization that was the fountainhead of Western culture. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle established the foundations of Western philosophy. Western literary forms are largely derived from Greek poetry and drama. Greek notions of harmony, proportion, and beauty have remained the touchstones for all subsequent Western art. A rational method of inquiry, so important to modern science, was conceived in ancient Greece. Many political terms are Greek in origin, and so too are concepts of the rights and duties of citizenship, especially as they were conceived in Athens, the first great democracy the world had seen. Especially during the classical era of the 5th century BCE, a century that began with the Persian Wars, the Greeks raised and debated the fundamental questions about the purpose of human existence, the structure of human society, and the nature of the universe that have concerned thinkers ever since. But the growth of an Athenian empire in that same century led to a mighty conflict with Sparta, the Great Peloponnesian War that resulted in the weakening of the Greek city-states and opened the door to an invasion by Philip II of Macedonia that put an end to their freedom in 338 BCE. But Greek culture did not die, and a new age, known as the Hellenistic era, eventually came into being. That era began with the conquest of the Persian Empire by Alexander the Great, the young successor to his father, Philip II. Though a great military leader, Alexander was not a good political administrator. He failed to establish any definite structure for the empire he had conquered, and 4 Hellenistic kingdoms eventually emerged as his successors. The society that emerged within those kingdoms is known as Hellenistic, meaning Greek-like or in imitation of the Greeks. The Greek language became the dominant one as Greek ideas became influential. Greek merchants, artists, philosophers, and soldiers found opportunities and rewards throughout the Near East, now a world of kingdoms rather than independent city-states. The Hellenistic period was, in its own way, a vibrant one. New cities arose and flourished. New philosophical doctrines such as Epicureanism and Stoicism captured the minds of many. Significant achievements occurred in literature and science, and Greek culture spread throughout the Near East, making an impact wherever it was carried. Although the Hellenistic era achieved a degree of political stability, by the late 3rd century BCE, signs of decline were beginning to multiply, and the growing power of Rome eventually endangered the Hellenistic world.